Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping into a really complex but crucial area, disorders of the male reproductive system. Think Chapter 43 from Porth's Pathophysiology.
Right. And this chapter covers a lot of ground structural problems, inflammation, even cancers. They all tend to affect, the three key things.
Yeah.
Urinary function, sexual function, and fertility.
Exactly. So our goal here is to sort of break down these conditions affecting the penis, testes, scrotum, and prostate. We want to make the underlying mechanisms really clear for you.
Yeah, distill it down. Make it instantly understandable, if you will.
So think of this as your guide through the congenital defects, the scary emergencies, and those chronic conditions. We'll hit the key points you need without getting totally bogged down in textbook details. Okay, let's dive right in. Starting externally with the penis. Some developmental issues can occur, right? Like hypospadias and epispadias. What's the actual difference there?
Good place to start. So hypospadias is where the urethral opening isn't at the tip, but somewhere on the underside, the ventral side of the penis. It's actually pretty common, about 1 in 350 male births.
1 in 350, wow. And what causes that?
It seems to be linked to insufficient androgen stimulation during a critical window in fetal development. We're talking weeks 8 to 14, roughly.
Okay, so if hypospadias is underneath.
Then epispadias is the opposite. The opening is on the top, the dorsal surface. It's much rarer, thankfully.
And clinically significant.
Oh, yes.
Hey.
Because it's often associated with a really severe condition called bladder exstrophy, where the bladder is essentially turned inside out and exposed on the abdominal wall.
Right, okay. Moving from birth defects to acquired issues, particularly with the foreskin, phimosis and paraphimosis. They sound similar, but are very different.
Very different, and one's an emergency. Phimosis is simply when the foreskin is too tight to be pulled back over the glands. It can be a chronic issue, sometimes linked to poor hygiene, and actually increases the risk for penile cancer down the line.
Okay, so that's the tight foreskin. What's paraphimosis then?
Paraphimosis is the dangerous one. This is where the foreskin is retracted, but then it gets stuck behind the glands and can't be pulled forward again. It acts like a constricting band.
Like a tourniquet.
Exactly. It cuts off blood flow, leading to swelling, ischemia, potentially even necrosis of the glands. That is a definite urologic emergency. Needs immediate attention.
Got it. Let's talk inflammation. Balanitis, inflammation of the glands, and sometimes it involves the foreskin too, balanoposthitis. Who tends to get this?
Key risk factors are things like poor hygiene, definitely. Also, conditions that suppress the immune system. Diabetes is a big one, especially if it's poorly controlled. And having phimosis makes it easier for inflammation to start.
And the cause can be tricky to figure out.
Yeah, because it could be bacterial, it could be fungal like candida, sometimes viral, even autoimmune things like lichen sclerosus. So you really need to identify the specific culprit, usually with the culture, to treat it effectively. Antibiotics, antifungals, depends on the bug.
Okay, now for something structural again, but acquired. Peyronie disease. This involves scar tissue, right?
Yeah.
How does that physically change an erection?
It's a fascinating mechanical problem. You get this localized progressive fibrosis, basically scar tissue forming a hard plaque, usually on the top midline within the tunica albuginea. That's the tough sheath around the erectile bodies.
And that scar tissue isn't stretchy.
Exactly. So when the penis fills with blood during an erection, the healthy tissue stretches, but the plaque doesn't. This causes the penis to bend, usually upwards, often painfully. It can make intercourse very difficult, sometimes impossible.
Makes sense. Before we get into dysfunction, maybe a quick refresher on how erections even work, the basic physiology.
Sure. It's fundamentally a neurovascular event. It starts with parasympathetic nerve signals. These release nitric oxide, NO, locally.
Nitric oxide, okay.
NO then triggers an increase in something called cyclic GMP, or cGMP. That causes the smooth muscle and the penile arteries to relax. When they relax, blood floods into the corpora cavernosa, the erectile chambers, under pressure. That's the erection.
And going back to flaccid.
That's detumescence. The sympathetic nervous system takes over, reduces the inflow, increases outflow, and the penis returns to a flaccid state. It's a balance between those two systems.
So erectile dysfunction, ED, is when that system fails. The inability to get or keep an erection sufficient for intercourse, is it mostly psychological?
No, not usually. While psychological factors can play a role, the most common physical cause is vascular, specifically arteriosclerosis, hardening of the arteries affecting those small penile arteries.
So it's a blood flow issue, fundamentally.
Precisely. And this is crucial. The risk factors for ED smoking, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, obesity, they're exactly the same as for heart disease and stroke. ED can actually be an early warning sign for broader cardiovascular problems.
That's a really important connection. Okay, the other extreme then. Priapism, the erection that won't go away, lasting over 4 hours. Why is that an emergency?
Because blood that's trapped and not flowing becomes deoxygenated, it can clot, and the tissue starts to suffer from ischemia, lack of oxygen. If it goes on too long, you get irreversible damage, fibrosis, scarring of the erectile tissue. Permanent ED can result.
And there are different types.
Yes, mainly ischemic versus non-ischemic. Ischemic is low flow, the blood is trapped, it's very rigid, very painful, and that's the absolute emergency. Non-ischemic is usually high flow, often due to trauma creating a fistula. It's less rigid, less painful, and less urgent. Sickle cell disease is also a known secondary cause of ischemic priapism.
Okay, let's move location now into the scrotum and testes. Starting with a congenital one again, cryptorchidism, undescended testes. Sounds structural, but it has bigger implications.
Huge implications. It's the most common congenital issue of the male GU tract, especially in premature infants, maybe 30% of them, while many descend on their own in the first few months.
But if they don't?
Intervention is critical because uncorrected cryptorchidism dramatically increases the risk of both infertility later in life and testicular cancer. We're talking a 20 to 40-fold increase in cancer risk.
20 to 40 times. Wow.
Yeah. It's why guidelines say referral to a specialist is needed if the testes hasn't descended by 6 months old. You can't wait on that.
Right. Now let's talk about fluid collections in the scrotum, like in figure 43-6, visually. How do we tell apart a hydrocele, hematocele, and spermatocele?
Okay, so think about the content of the fluid. A hydrocele is the most common. It's just excess, clear, serous fluid collecting between the layers of the tunica vaginalis, that sac around the testes. Clinically, it transilluminates, shine a light through the scrotum, and it glows.
Okay, clear fluid glows. What about hematocele?
Hemato means blood. So a hematocele is blood collecting in that same space, usually after trauma or surgery. It won't transilluminate, and the scrotum might look bruised, reddish, or purple.
And spermatocele?
Spermatocele is different. It's a specific cyst, usually painless, that forms on the epididymis, which is attached to the testis. It's filled with sperm and seminal fluid. It's often small and does transilluminate, like a hydrocele, but its location is key.
Got it. What about varicocele? People sometimes call it a bag of worms.
Yeah, that's a very descriptive term for how it feels on palpation. A varicocele is essentially varicose veins, but in the pampiniform plexus, the network of veins draining the testis within the spermatic cord.
It's usually on one side.
Most often on the left side, yeah. It's due to the anatomy of how the left testicular vein drains, making it more prone to backflow and valve incompetence.
Does it cause problems?
It can impact fertility. The dilated veins hold more warm blood near the testis, raising the local temperature. This can impair sperm production, leading to lower sperm counts and reduced motility.
Okay, another emergency we absolutely have to highlight. Testicular torsion. What exactly happens?
Torsion means twisting. The spermatic cord, which carries the blood vessels to the testes, twists on itself. This immediately cuts off the arterial blood supply and venous drainage.
And time is critical.
Extremely critical. Testicular viability drops sharply after about 6 hours of ischemia. Delay means potentially losing the testicle.
What are the key signs to look for?
Sudden, severe testicular pain is the hallmark. The affected testicle is often high-riding, swollen, and very tender. Crucially, the cremasteric reflex, where stroking the inner thigh normally makes the testicle rise, is usually absent on the affected side. That absence is a huge red flag, needs immediate surgical evaluation.
Understood. Okay, shifting to inflammation again. Epididymitis and orchitis.
Right. Epididymitis is inflammation of the epididymis, that structure coiled on the back of the testis. Orchitis is inflammation of the testis itself. Sometimes they occur together.
What causes epididymitis?
It's usually an infection spreading upwards from the urethra or bladder. The cause often depends on age and sexual activity. In younger men, say 14 to 35, it's frequently sexually transmitted infections, gonorrhea, chlamydia.
And in older men or boys?
More likely to be caused by common urinary tract pathogens like E. coli, often associated with UTIs, or structural issues like BPH.
And orchitis. Inflammation of the actual testicle.
That's often a complication of a systemic infection that spreads to the testes. The classic example is mumps virus. Mumps orchitis can be serious because in about 30% of cases, it can cause permanent damage to spermatogenesis, leading to infertility.
Good to know. Lastly, for this section, testicular cancer. You mentioned the link with cryptorchidism. Why is this so relevant for younger men specifically?
Because it's the most common solid tumor in men aged 15 to 35. That's the peak age range. The good news is that it's highly curable, especially if caught early. Survival rates are over 95%.
Are there different types?
Yes, about 90% arise from germ cells. They're broadly split into seminomas, which tend to be more uniform, sensitive to radiation, and have a good prognosis, and non-seminomas. Non-seminomas are more varied things like embryonal carcinoma, teratoma, choriocarcinoma, sometimes more aggressive, might produce tumor markers.
What's the first sign usually?
Often it's subtle, maybe a slight enlargement of the testicle, a feeling of heaviness, or sometimes dull discomfort. Not usually sharp pain initially. Self-exam is really important for early detection. Tumor markers like AFP and beta-HCG are also used in diagnosis and follow-up. All right, final section, the prostate gland, which sits right at the base of the bladder surrounding the urethra. Let's start with inflammation here, prostatitis. There are different categories.
Yeah, the classification can seem a bit confusing. Let's focus on the main bacterial types first. Acute bacterial prostatitis seems pretty straightforward.
It usually is. It comes on suddenly: fever, chills, feeling unwell, plus significant urinary symptoms like pain, burning, difficulty voiding. It's typically caused by bacteria ascending from the urethra, often E. coli, similar to a UTI.
Okay, that's acute. What about chronic bacterial prostatitis?
This one's more subtle, more frustrating. It's characterized by recurrent UTIs, with the same bacteria often found in prostatic secretions between infections. The issue is it's hard to completely eradicate the bacteria because antibiotics don't penetrate the prostate tissue very well, especially when it's chronically inflamed.
So, relapsing infections. And then there's a non-bacterial type.
Yes, and it's actually the most common type overall. Chronic prostatitis, chronic pelvic pain syndrome, category 3. These men have the symptoms: pelvic pain, urinary symptoms, but crucially, there's no bacteria consistently identified. It can be inflammatory or non-inflammatory based on lab tests, but the cause is often unclear. Very frustrating for patients.
I can imagine. Okay, moving from inflammation to enlargement. Benign prostatic hyperplasia, or BPH.
Yeah.
Super common in older men, right? Affects most men over 80.
Absolutely. Over 75% of men over 80 have some degree BPH. It's age-related enlargement.
And how does this benign growth cause such problems with urination?
It's all about location. BPH involves nodular growth, hyperplasia, specifically in the periurethral zone of the prostate, the part immediately surrounding the urethra. So, as a prostate enlarges inwards, it literally squeezes the urethra.
Like stepping on a hose.
Exactly like stepping on a hose. This compression, this obstruction, leads directly to the symptoms: difficulty starting the stream, hesitancy, needing to pee frequently, especially at night, nocturia, a weak or interrupted stream, feeling like you can't fully empty the bladder.
Makes sense. What's driving that growth hormonally as men age?
It's a bit complex, but two key things. First, even as overall testosterone levels might decline, the ratio of estrogen to testosterone increases, and estrogen seems to promote prostate growth. Second, and probably more important, the prostate converts testosterone into a much more potent androgen called dihydrotestosterone, or DHT.
DHT, okay.
The aging prostate actually accumulates high levels of DHT, and DHT is a powerful stimulus for prostate cell growth and hyperplasia. This hormonal basis is why treatments often target these pathways.
Like the medications.
Precisely. You have 5 alpha reductase inhibitors, which block the conversion of testosterone to DHT, shrinking the prostate over time. And you have alpha-1 adrenergic blockers, which don't shrink the prostate but relax the smooth muscle in the prostate and bladder neck, making it easier to urinate by reducing that dynamic obstruction.
Okay, that clarifies BPH. Now, the big one, prostate cancer. Also very common, the most common non-skin cancer in U.S. men, especially after 50. How does its location and presentation differ from BPH?
This is a really critical distinction. Unlike BPH, which is central, most prostate cancers, adenocarcinomas, arise in the peripheral zones of the prostate, the outer areas.
So further away from the urethra.
Right, which means in the early stages, prostate cancer often doesn't cause any urinary symptoms at all. It's frequently asymptomatic.
So how is it usually found then?
Often it's detected during a routine checkup, specifically through a digital rectal examination, the DRE. The examiner might feel a hard, irregular nodule on the surface of the prostate, which feels very different from the smooth, rubbery enlargement of BPH. Or it's picked up by an elevated PSA blood test.
Ah, the PSA test. Let's talk screening and staging briefly.
Okay. Screening typically involves both the DRE and the prostate-specific antigen PSA test. PSA testing is a bit controversial regarding widespread screening in all men, but it's definitely valuable for early detection, particularly in higher risk groups, like African American men or those with a family history.
And if cancer is suspected?
Diagnosis requires a prostate biopsy. If cancer is confirmed, it's staged to determine how advanced it is. This involves the Gleason score, which grades the aggressiveness of the cancer cells, and the TNM system, which assesses tumor size, T, lymph node involvement, N, and distant metastasis.
Where is it typically metastasized?
Prostate cancer has a known predilection for spreading to the bones, so M1 disease often presents as bone pain, maybe in the back or hips, sometimes as the first symptom in advanced cases.
And treatment depends heavily on that stage.
Absolutely. For localized low-risk cancer, options might range from active surveillance, watchful waiting, to definitive treatments like surgery, radical prostatectomy, or radiation therapy.
And for more advanced disease?
If it's spread, hormonal therapy becomes key. Since prostate cancer growth is often driven by androgens, treatments aim to drastically lower testosterone levels. This can be done surgically by removing the testes, orchiectomy, or medically using drugs like GnRH analogs. This confirms that hormonal link we talked about.
These treatments have side effects.
Yes, significant ones.
Yeah.
Surgery carries risks like incontinence and erectile dysfunction due to potential nerve damage. Hormonal therapy causes symptoms related to low testosterone, like hot flashes, loss of libido, fatigue, and potential long-term effects like osteoporosis. So treatment decisions are always a balance. #tag OutroWap.
Wow, okay. That was a very efficient run-through of some really important and sometimes complex conditions. We covered a huge range, from those congenital issues like hypospadias, through the immediate emergencies like torsion and paraphimosis, right up to BPH and prostate cancer, which affects so many men as they age.
Yeah, and I think if there's one major connection for you to take away, it's probably that vascular link. Remember how ED is often tied to arteriosclerosis, the same process causing heart attacks and strokes? It's frequently a systemic issue showing up locally.
That's a great point. And also the importance of location, right? BPH being central causes urinary symptoms early, while peripheral prostate cancer might be silent until much later.
Exactly. Location dictates the presentation.
So the big picture here seems to be about recognizing risk factors, understanding the underlying mechanisms like hormonal influences or blood flow issues, and appreciating that even things that seem minor initially, like an undescended testis or chronic phimosis, can have serious long-term consequences for fertility or cancer risk. Early awareness and intervention are key.
Couldn't agree more. And maybe the final thought for you to ponder. We know there's a strong link now between metabolic health, cardiovascular disease, and conditions like ED. So thinking ahead, how could we potentially leverage male reproductive health checks more effectively? Could they serve as a kind of early warning system for detecting broader systemic diseases sooner? Something to think about.